for watching Lessons in Minutes with Jaylee. Like, share, and don't forget to subscribe.
For this session, we're looking at the general journal as a book of original entry, or simply the journal. Now, for the lesson, the objective is that you should be able to explain the purpose of the journal. Now, let's get into it. So there are different types of books of original entry. And of course, you should know, based on the transactions, which book of original entry to be used. Now, in terms of the different transactions as it relates to the general journal, let's look at those that would be recorded in the general journal. And the first one is to record the purchase and sale of fixed assets on credit. So remember, the purchase and sale of fixed assets on credit. If you have purchased or sold a fixed asset and the payment was made, whether it be by cash or by check, then the recording would not be done in your general journal, but in your cash book. So only if you have purchased or sold the fixed asset on credit, then that will be recorded in your general journal. Another use is to record the correction of errors. So there may be errors that were picked up based on the checks made of the accounting records. And once you have identified the errors, then you would firstly make a record of that in your general journal, or we are going to correct that error. And then you will proceed to making the entries in your ledger accounts. Another use is to write off bad debts. So the general journal is also used for the writing off of bad debts, and also to record opening entries. Another is to record closing entries, and another purpose of the general journal is to record other items such as adjustments to any of the adjust entries in the ledgers. So the general journal is used to record the purchase and sale of fixed assets on credit, to do the correction of errors, to show the writing off of bad debts, to record opening entries, also closing entries, and other items as it relates adjustments to any of the entries in the ledgers. And please note that these are just some of the uses of the general journal. Now, each book of original entry does has a format, right? And we're talking about the general journal now. But in terms of preparing the general journal, what is the format and what is the principle in writing it up? So we're going to focus on that. So we have the layout of the general journal, or you can simply call it the journal. Your title is important. So whether you write the general journal or simply the journal, it's the same. Your date, which is very important in accounting because you need your date to serve as evidence as well of when the transactions took place. The details, your folio, a column for debit, one for the amount to be credited. Now, in terms of your details, please note that the general journal, all you're doing is indicating based on the transaction, which account you're going to debit and also the account that will be credited. So definitely you know that you would need to know your double entry. So if you have not recalled how to enter up ledger accounts in terms of whether you're debiting the account or crediting the account based on the transactions, you have to review that because you need that knowledge so you can prepare your general journal. And in preparing your general journal is basically making a note of which account you're debiting based on the transaction, which account you're crediting. No, the item that you're debiting based on a transaction should be listed first. Hence, in the first line, you're seeing the name of the account to be debited and the amount to be written under the debit column. Notice the name of the account to be credited would be listed after, but this item must be indented. But why is it indented? This is done because it makes it easier to distinguish between the debit and the credit item. So once you look at the general journal and you see the item indented, definitely know that that is the credit item. And the item above would be the item to be debited. And after that, you're seeing the details, the narrative. Now, what is the narrative as it relates to the general journal? It is simple, nothing difficult, and that is a description and explanation of the transaction. All you're doing is describing and explaining the transaction. So simply summarizing it. Nothing long, but of course it must indicate what the transaction was. So you're describing and explaining the transaction, and that is your narrative. Now, in exam, you may be asked to write narrative, or you may see that narrations are not required. If it is not required, definitely you would leave that out. But once it did not indicate that narrations are not required, then you ensure that you enter that because there may be marks for it. So please ensure that you record it. And don't worry, you will understand how to write narrations because of course you'll get used to this throughout your knowledge of the general journal. So there are advantages of using the general journal, but we're going to look at two of those. The first one is it reduces the risk of entering the item once only instead of having double entry. Now with this, because you're indicating the item that you're debiting, the item that you're crediting, you're basically making a record of that in the diary. When I say diary, I mean the general journal. You're indicating what you're debiting based on the transaction, what you're crediting. Then once you move over to making your posting in the ledgers, then of course, because you have that information, it reduces the risk of you just making one entry instead of having the double entry. Another is that it makes fraud by bookkeepers more difficult. Again, it makes fraud by bookkeepers more difficult. And those are the two advantages that we're zeroing on for this lesson as it relates to your general journal. Now, when we started out, the objective was that at the end of the lesson, you should be able to explain the purpose of the journal. Now that we're at the end, you should be able to tell us what are some of the uses of the general journal, indicating the format, explaining the format, and knowing for the account to be debited, that item must be listed first, the account to be credited must be listed after, but the credit item must be indented. You now know what is narrative, right? So the next lesson, you will be looking at some examples in writing up the general journal. So there'll be a question that we focus on in the next lesson on the general journal. So this is where we end for this lesson. And I trust that you're now able to explain the purpose of the general journal.
Like, share, and don't forget to subscribe.